I'm really happy to be here with everyone right now. And to those of you watching this later, welcome. And I'm glad that you could catch up with us. So while I introduce myself, you could grab a sheet of paper if you happen to have one nearby and maybe something to write with, because there'll be a few little interactive exercises later that'll be more fun if you can write. But if you have a good imagination, you'll still be able to participate even if you're on the road or don't happen to have something to write with. So I'm Christina Karns. I'm an assistant research professor in psychology at the Center for Brain Injury Research and Training, and we're here at the University of Oregon. I direct a project called the Emotions and Neuroplasticity Project. This is a project that is aiming to use neuroplasticity principles to improve positive emotions and reduce stress, particularly for folks who are at risk. So I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me. So today I'm going to be focusing on how we can grow gratitude and altruism in the brain. And I hope to give you a sense of how our brain systems support complex social emotions like gratitude and altruism. These aren't simple emotions, right? These aren't the kinds of things that we see in a young baby. They basically are expressing those basic emotions. These are a little more complex and they require a lot more social experience. And I hope to show how we can develop these beneficial emotions supported by these principles of neuroplasticity. So I'll also plan to demonstrate some ways that we can all practice what we preach, so to speak. And I'd like to invite a discussion. Hopefully at the end, we'll have time for some questions and discussion that I believe Amanda will be moderating about how to best adapt practices to various ages and abilities, which is a subject of ongoing research in my group and certainly in progress. Okay, so I started this talk just now with an introduction, and I answered this question, right? Who am I? And I said, well, I'm a researcher, a neuroscientist, but there's more to me, right? So I'm also an educator. Before this call, I was prepping for next week when I'll have 170 new students. I'm also a parent with a couple of kids in public schools, and I'm navigating these systems as a parent. I have a few friends, so I'm a friend, I'm somebody's partner, I give support, and I also need support. So there's a lot going on in here, right? In our sense of who am I? And if you take a minute to consider who you are, I'm sure you'll have just as much going on, if not more. So just from the list of enrollees in this webinar, I saw that we have school psychologists, school nurses, special service providers, specialists, administrators, educators of all sorts. But that's really just part of who you are, right? It's really just a little sliver. So all these roles are for some of the ways that we interact with society, but not all. So I want to introduce to you this framework that's shown in this slide. It's a social ecological perspective. And you may be familiar with these sorts of ideas that our self is embedded in our relationships with our friends and family. Our friends and family are embedded in a broader community. And these nested frameworks can help us think a bit more about the challenges that we might have navigating these different roles and just how taxing they can be. So we exist in this social ecology, this interactive environment where we navigate ourselves at the core with these other broader relationships. So if you happen to be able to grab a sheet of paper, and it's fine if you didn't, you can imagine, but you can imagine drawing these three nested circles. And if you could, please mark or imagine on this circle how you would characterize your particular professional role in education. So you could figure out anything here. Just give it a try and be as straightforward or as creative as you're feeling right now as you kind of look at this framework, thinking about your day-to-day professional roles. So maybe just as an example, I'll use myself as the guinea pig. So as a researcher, I put myself out here right in the community zone, because a lot of the research and the teaching that I do is as a community member, really out in the world outside of where those close friends and family are. But maybe I bring a lot of myself to my work, right? And maybe you do as well. A lot of passion, care, motivation to enact change. And maybe, like me, you rely on friends and family to support you in that work. So it might be that, as the slide is showing, sort of you're taking yourself out of this little core and really putting it out here into the community, kind of at the forefront, at the edges of where your relationships are. And you can think of it as sort of a sphere of influence, right? Now, as educators and support professionals, you're also probably pretty adept, I'm guessing, at thinking of children as really an individual as well, right? They have their own little adorable individual selves, and they're also situated in this social ecology. So part of your professional role might also be navigating relationships with a child directly, right? So you're taking your role out here in the community and moving it inward to try to connect with that child and their kind of core self. But this also involves interactions with that child's family, helping them navigate relationships with friends, and professionals in these support roles and educational roles need to move between these spaces often, right? And that can frankly be pretty stressful and tiring for many of us. And just like kids, you know, kids too can feel exhausted by kind of navigating these relationships through the course of the day. And I think that we often kind of ignore how much that requires social emotional intelligence, how much practice it requires to hone our own social emotional responses and have self-regulation. And so we, as a result, we're not really taught actual practices that we can use to do these things. And then how are we going to be teaching youngsters about this, right? So I just want to put out that introduction to remind all of us that as part of this educational community, we're providing social emotional support to students, as well as their families, supporting their well-being, and supporting your own well-being is important as you navigate these professional responsibilities. It sounds daunting, but practice makes us better at these skills. And the better we get at these sorts of skills, the more we can model them for others. So taking time to develop these skills in your own practice helps you in your professional roles as well. So that's kind of the space where we're operating together with this webinar. And I'm giving this as a context to situate some of the more scientific ideas about positive emotions in this framework. So we'll be talking about pro-social emotions here in a context of self-care for yourself, and also we can think about how to use this framework for care for others. All right, so transitioning a bit here. So getting back to our objectives today, I mentioned that my goal was to lay out a background about how brain systems support complex social emotions like gratitude and altruism, and how we can develop these beneficial emotions. So let's start out with some of these ideas. Now, all learning, as most, I'm sure all of you know, is neuroplasticity, right? When we learn a new skill, it literally becomes part of our brain. It literally changes the way that the computations are done in our brain. So let's take a minute to review some of the neuroplasticity basics that led to the research on more complex emotions that I'll tell you about in the second half of this talk. So of course, your brain is completely amazing. There are 100 billion neurons in the brain. That's 100,000 millions of neurons. The same number of stars are in our galaxy. And just to put that in context, there's on our crowded planet only 8 billion people, right? So as insane as this number 100 billion is, guess what? There are 100 trillion synapses in the brain. So the synapses are the places where neurons connect to other neurons. 100 trillion synapses, 100 trillion connections. So that's actually 100,000 billions. So as my kiddos would say, that's a gazillion. And there's a lot of learning that goes into wiring up 100 trillion synapses. So this leads us to the first of 3 basic neuroplasticity principles that I'll be reviewing. The first principle is that connection takes action. Connection takes action. This means that to wire up the brain, we need experiences. So the little mnemonic for this is that neurons that fire together wire together, and neurons out of sync fail to link. This is one of the basic computational principles that allows us to build up these complex neural networks that help us do all the cool things we do. So, you know, if you're a Facebooker, old like me using Facebook, I guess none of my college students are using it, but anyways, you know, think of this as your Facebook feed. The more you respond to a friend's posts or texts, the more that they'll respond back to your posts or texts. You're sort of strengthening that connection. And the less you respond, the less likely your friend is going to respond to your post, right? So it's sort of this mutual connection where things that happen together are more likely to lead to connection later on. So this is the same thing with neurons. When they fire together, they wire together. And to get this wiring that's happening together, you need to be taking action and practicing. So that's principle 1. This is a picture of how neurons are aligned inside the cortex of the brain. And at birth, we can see some beautiful little tree-like structures there that are the neurons branching out to connect to other neurons. And at birth, they're looking a little sparse. At 6 years, we have this really dense connection. So there's been this overabundance of synaptic connections between the neurons. And then later, if we look at the brain at around 14 years of age, we see that many of these connections have been pruned away. So this is the classic bloom and prune principle of neural development, where we have this exuberant connectivity, and then the connections that aren't as useful or important get pruned away. So in the earlier age groups, there's actually a lot of potential for sculpting these neural connections. But of course, neuroplasticity isn't just for youngsters, it's for us oldsters as well. So that's what that looks like there. But there's an important second principle here. Neuroplasticity principle 2 is that there is diversity in development. Diversity in development. What that means is that brain regions develop at different rates. So just like individual children might be at different stages in development, brain regions also have different developmental rates. So what this would look like is this graph is showing the lifespan here up until young adulthood. And in the earliest years from birth to about age 6, we're seeing that we have an overabundance of connections in the basic sensory cortex of the brain. As we get a little later, I'm sorry, that was 6 months, not years, but as we get a little later to early childhood, there's more of the association cortex that has this exuberance of connections. And it's much later that we're seeing the prefrontal cortex develop. So you may have heard the classic kind of idea that the frontal cortex of the brain isn't mature until age 25. This is pretty much what they're talking about, that in terms of reaching a mature profile, we don't really see that until fairly late. So these little babies are really working on sensation and perception. The school agers are learning about associations, and our teens are really working on that social processing, those more complex social emotional responses. But of course, everything's happening simultaneously across these different brain regions, but they have different profiles. Now, neuroplasticity principle 3 is that plasticity is vulnerability. So we often think of neuroplasticity as a positive. So when brains are changeable with experience, that's a good thing, right? Well, that depends on what your experiences are, right? So this idea that plasticity is a double-edged sword, it can cut both ways, is because that when a brain region is plastic during a period of development, it is more vulnerable to an impoverished environment. And the flip side of that is that during this period of vulnerability, it is enhanceable with interventions, right, with targeted practice. There's some resources here on this slide, and I believe the slides will be uploaded so that you could pull these up later if you'd like more details on this. Okay, so to review those 3 principles, neurons that fire together wire together. There's diversity in development, different brain regions develop at different rates, and neuroplasticity is also vulnerability. So if you're explaining this to a kiddo and you're thinking about encouraging them to make positive changes and that they can do great things with their amazing brain, we want to remind them that special systems in the brain support all the things that we think, feel, and do. When we learn something new, it's because we've created new connections in the brain and we've strengthened those connections with practice, and that our brains keep changing. Even as an adult, our brain is flexible and adaptable, and that's how we learn new things. So this amazing brain with trillions and trillions of connections is there to support learning, and it is going to wire up with the things that we practice every day. So if you're wanting more resources on the basics of neuroplasticity, this is a video resource. It's free that our group put out a number of years ago called Changing Brains. It's available at changingbrains.org or on YouTube. And so you can pull up more information through these free videos if you'd like. But that just kind of situates you, I think, in this framework of brain development, where we can move a little bit beyond some of those basics to thinking about the neuroplasticity of complex systems. So how do our brain systems support complex social emotions like altruism and gratitude? Sometimes I use this kind of silly example, but just to illustrate how complex these positive emotions are. So imagine that you come home from work one day and you see a little envelope tucked under the doormat of your front door, and you pick it up and you open it. Turns out your birthday is coming up, and inside there's a couple of tickets to your favorite musical group with a note inviting you to go together to this concert, right? So you might be feeling kind of grateful right now, especially if that's your favorite band. And now imagine that you read down to the bottom of the note, and the person that it's from is your very dear friend. So of course you're feeling very grateful and very happy to go with them to this concert. But now imagine that you read to the end of the note, and now you see the name of, let's say, a coworker who's sort of interested in dating you, but you're not interested at all. And so there, the emotion that we feel is a little bit more awkwardness, right? We're not really feeling grateful for this benefit. We're feeling kind of awkward. So these social relationships very much shape how we interpret a potential benefit. And the understanding of the complexity of these social relationships, as we can imagine, takes a long time to develop. We're not seeing the same things in a toddler as we're seeing in a school ager. We're not seeing the same thing in a school ager that we're going to see in a teen or an adult. So sometimes that little example gives people a sense like, yeah, these are pretty complicated things. Or, you know, why are we altruistic? Why do we do good things for other people when we don't necessarily get a reward? So when I approached this as a research topic, I was interested in the idea that these complex social emotions should be supported by a number of different brain systems working together. It's not going to be the case that we have, you know, a little gratitude area in the brain. It's going to be the case that we have a lot of complex systems working together. And I think that understanding a little bit more about how these systems are put together can help us think about training up these pro-social emotions, these positive emotions more specifically. So here's two different diagrams of brain systems that are involved in social cognition. So on the left here is a kind of cutaway view of the brain. It's like if you sliced the brain right there down the middle, and you can see the profile there. And on the right, there's a view like if we were, you know, looking at the side of the brain. So instead of being a cutaway, that's representing the outer edge of the brain. Now in orange here, ignore all the little letters for now, but all those orange regions there that are deep in the center of the brain are part of the reward network. The reward network. Part of those are I'll read off the names of them here just in case they ring a bell from other areas, but all you need to remember or take away from this to follow the talk is just that these are part of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, right? This is part of our prefrontal cortex, which is involved in emotional processing. So the VMPSC, ventromedial, the orbital frontal cortex. There's some areas deep down in there, like the nucleus accumbens. These groups work together, these brain systems, brain regions work together to give us a rewarding feeling when there's something that we like. In green here, oh, so yes, there we go. In green here, we have what is often called these days a cognitive or social perspective taking network. Cognitive meaning how we think, and social perspective being how we think about the minds of other people, whether we can infer their intention, whether we know what they're thinking about, or what they think about us. So that ability to take on the perspective of someone else is supported by these more lateral regions along the temporal lobe, the superior temporal sulcus, for example, and they interact with frontal lobe regions like the medial prefrontal cortex to support this ability to think about the minds of other people. And we know sometimes youngsters aren't too good at this, and we probably know some oldsters that aren't too good at this either. Now, another region that comes up a lot when we think about social processing is actually negative emotions. This region deep in the brain, the DACC here in pink, is the dorsal anterior cingulate. Now, this region is involved in alerting us when we make an error. Well, it also is involved in empathy, especially when we're observing the pain of someone else. So it's empathy for pain. And so, you know, there's a positive social system. There's kind of this more negative social system. We kind of need all of these for our social interactions. And to help us remember it, I wanted to start out with the technical language, but if we just remember that this is the reward network, and here's, you can probably tell my kids are Mario fans. Here's Mario with a bunch of coins. So this golden region is just helping us feel good when we do something. Cognitive social perspective taking, that's like helping us take someone else's point of view. So, you know, in some of the Mario games, you're following along with Mario and maybe seeing what he's seeing as he navigates through space. Kind of a fun way to remember it here. And then it's funny with the webinar, I get no feedback at all, whether you're rolling your eyes or chuckling. So I'll just chuckle for myself. Anyways, we'll try to keep it fun. And so finally, for this negative affect or cognitive control, I have a little video game controller. And how does that relate to empathy? Well, you know, sometimes when Mario dies, you get a little vibration in your video game controller here. So it's like giving you feedback, but it's also allowing you to kind of control what Mario's doing. So to be successful in this video game, we need reward, we need perspective taking, and we need control, and we need them to be working together. So this little diagram is just representing that relationship. It's reminding us, sorry, I'm going to take that away for a minute. It's reminding us that reward, perspective taking, control, all these things need to work together, not in isolation, to support positive or negative social interactions. And although in the last slide I illustrated these with kind of little buttons, little circles on the brain indicating where they are, we know that the brain is highly connected. You know, with all those connections, there's a lot of wiring to support those interactions. This is an image of the connections in the brain taken with a type of MRI neuroimaging. It's kind of illustrating how dense these connections are, how regions of the brain even far away from each other have these super highways of connections, allowing them to communicate with each other. So looking at these regions in isolation isn't likely to be as fruitful as looking at how they interact. All right. So, I meant to skip that one too. Here we go. All right, so given that framework of, through that framework of neuroplasticity, I want to remind you that social reasoning and prosocial emotions take a long time to develop. And when we look at those same regions like the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex is one of the slowest to mature. So are those deeper temporal lobe regions, right? So because these take such a long time to develop, we might expect that they would be plastic longer. So applying this to traits, giving us a little bit more intuition about some of the thinking behind this. When you think about someone who's wise, patient, and compassionate, you're probably thinking of someone a bit older, maybe a wise grandmother, right? But when you're thinking of someone impulsive and egocentric, we might be picturing someone a bit younger, right? Not always true to generalize, but it'll give us something to hold on to here. So then the question becomes, if these emotions are plastic so long, if they take such a long time to develop, how do we influence them? How can we influence positive and pro-social attitudes with training, with teaching, and with intervention? So let's take a test case. So the first place I started with the research I've been doing is asking which brain systems support the pro-social emotion altruism. So altruism is giving when you're not being watched and when you don't expect to be repaid. And of course, there are many philosophical debates about whether altruism itself can be rewarding or not. We're not going to get into that here. We're just going to kind of take this as it is, that sometimes you do something nice even when you're not expecting repayment. So how do we know what brain systems might support this, this state, this emotional state? Well, the approach we took was to ask a bunch of people about their own altruistic values, and then observe their brain responses in an altruism task that we could do in our brain scanner. And we were asking the question, which brain responses correlate with people's self-reported altruism? So what we did is we created a task, just a kind of like a little game that they could play in the scanner, but this game had real life consequences. So what it looked like was people observed transfers of money, was illustrated on the screen that they were watching. And sometimes they would observe themselves get money. And this corresponded, they knew, to a real life transfer of money to a fund where they would take home money at the end of the scanning session. So sometimes they observed themselves getting money. Other times they actually observe a food bank, in this case, Food for Lane County, getting money. Sometimes they watch themselves lose money, and sometimes they watch themselves give money to the food bank, right? So when they watch these real life events, we can monitor what their brain is doing when this occurs. So what we found is that when we look at the way that the brain responds when you're giving money versus receiving money, a part of the brain deep in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is responsive. And we also see that these same responses do relate. They are associated with people's self-reported altruism, and also the degree of gratitude that someone reports that they feel day to day. So this suggested that the reward system parts of the brain are sensitive to charitable giving. So people that were more altruistic had more response in this brain region when they were giving than when they were receiving. We were happy to see as well that this had been shown previously by a co-author of ours on the paper. Well, something similar was shown, that the pro-social disposition, meaning someone's kind of like their kindness or how much they enjoy giving to others or doing for other people, the choices they made in this task around giving, as well as their age, all overlapped in this same brain region in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So that's aligning with our ideas around this being a slowly developing system that can change with practice and can change over a long period of time. So reward is subjective. It happens when we're giving, but also receiving. So now we knew a little bit more about what brain regions support altruism. And we saw this in a part of the brain that's slow to mature. But the question was, can we actually do anything to change the way it responds? So what we did, oops, sorry. Screen is sharing, there we go. Oh, I don't know why that happened. There we go. So, sorry. Here's what we planned is we wanted to see if this region could be changed with practice over a shorter period of time. So at session 1, we had people do this task in the scanner, and then we had them journal for 3 weeks. And then after those 3 weeks, we had them do another scanning session. Now, during those 3 weeks, we divided people up into 2 groups and randomly assigned them. And one group was randomly assigned to do gratitude journaling every night for those 3 weeks. And the other group was randomly assigned to just journal about more neutral topics every day. And we were interested in whether gratitude journaling would change this altruism response in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Would it change how rewarding giving was when we practice gratitude? So here's what that looked like. As we give people a prompt, it looked something like this. There are many events or people in our lives that we might be thankful for. And just while I'm reading this, you might jot down a few little keywords or notes of the things that you've been grateful for this past week. So just take a minute and think back over this past week and write down a few keywords about the things that you're grateful for or the people that you're grateful for. And so that's what we asked them to do. We had some different kinds of prompts to keep it lively night to night, but that's what people did in the study over those 3-week period. And then the comparison group would write a neutral journal entry. Here on the slide at the bottom, I have a note about Hassel's journaling. We didn't run this in the scanner, but there's a lot of other studies, including our own, that have used Hassel's as well, sort of venting about the things that make you grumpy. Turns out that might make you do even worse, so we didn't include it in this study. So here's the kinds of things that we would get, just some sample types of entries that we would see. So someone might write, I'm grateful that my friend helped me move into my new apartment. She came and helped even after a long day at work when she was tired. She put on some great music and actually made it fun. It's great to have good friends that support me. For a neutral prompt, we might get something like this. I had a good week. I passed the exam I was worried about, and it was my friend's birthday. Those sound like positive things, and it's true. We do see positive things in the neutral prompts. We also see negative things as well sometimes, but it's a little different than the gratitude journal entries, which were more focused on the help of others or unusually positive events that made someone feel grateful. Hassel's entry might look like, I had to rewrite my paper because my computer crashed. My professor didn't give me extra time, so I had to stay up all night. And so we had a look at all these journal entries and we rated them for how positive or negative they were. And the warmer colors here on the slide represent positive emotions like joy, trust, and surprise. And we do see more of those emotions in our gratitude journal entries than in the neutral prompts, and of course in the Hassel's prompts as well. Now, how is it that we're seeing things like anger or sadness in a gratitude journal prompt? Well, sometimes when we are most grateful for something, it's also when we might be in the greatest need. So if you were very sick or you lost someone close to you, that's actually an opportunity for you to receive the help of others. And so we would see a little negativity expressed also in those journal entries, but not as much as the positive. So that's what they did for those 3 weeks. And we were really happy to see that the same region that was associated with altruism across individuals, which is shown here on the left, and the little yellow blobs in the brain, also the same region increased its giving response with gratitude journaling. That's the purple blob over on the right. So if you were doing the gratitude journaling, then giving became more rewarding. That's sort of the take-home message here. And we didn't see that in the people that were just journaling about neutral topics every night. So that's pretty cool that we can, over a relatively short period of time, kind of retune the brain to see giving, which is actually kind of not getting a benefit, but to see that as something potentially more beneficial or rewarding. So the takeaway here, I think for us, kind of like jumping way back from the zooming in that we did here in the research domain and all that science, you know, the takeaway is that we should see that serving others can be more rewarding, especially when we connect to our own sense of gratitude for what we receive from others. And it's really fascinating to me that practicing something like gratitude actually changed the way the brain responded to something so tangible like giving and receiving money. There's a lot of other research that shows that the more that we're grateful, the more that we're motivated to give back in some way. So it's great to, some great ways to incorporate gratitude into your routine can be something like this gratitude journal. Other ideas are like a gratitude jar where you just jot little notes and you might drop it into a jar and then take a peek at those later. Maybe you have some ideas as well, or you've done your own gratitude practice. Gratitude support groups are great. Or just remembering, kind of setting an intention to express heartfelt gratitude to other people and to graciously receive gratitude from others. So that's hard. That's hard. You know, I'm not a Pollyanna by nature. I am a bit of a cynic, but I guess a hopeful cynic. And so, you know, it can be hard to feel grateful, especially when things are challenging, when our lives are very stressful and demanding. But I think focusing on the little things, the concrete things, can really be a good place to start, or a way to help connect to our own, to ourself really on those days that are the most challenging, is kind of start small and concrete. And I think it's interesting that, at least in my own sort of practice around trying to develop, you know, positive and positive emotional responses, or just kind of a sustainable positivity, has really been focusing on the concrete and doing it regularly. And it's interesting because that's also what other research has shown is great for kids, is that you know, because children are so different at different ages, there are a lot of different approaches one could take to develop gratitude or other pro-social emotions in children or adolescents. But starting with the concrete things can often be a really good place to start. Maybe that's why a lot of research has focused on things like journaling or a written practice, because it does tend to make things a bit more concrete. So what about kids? What are some actual building blocks that might help kids improve their positive social interactions or positive emotions? We're a long way from doing all that we want to do, but I'll start with talking about some basic building blocks that we've worked on over the past years. These basic building blocks are more focused on improving child attention and self-regulation, including emotional regulation. So one project has been implemented in Head Start schools across Lane County here in Oregon. We have a curriculum we've developed called Creating Connections that involves training children in the classroom to improve their attention and self-regulation, including emotional regulation strategies. Part of this is also some parent training that has been based on Oregon Social Learning Center programs designed to reduce family stress. So we're trying to interface between the child's school interaction and their family interaction. So kind of bridging that divide across in that social emotional framework. And this has been a 10-year collaborative partnership between the University of Oregon and Head Start of Lane County. And it's now been implemented countywide. And basically what parents learn as part of these support groups is contingency-based discipline, and discipline in sort of a positive way, that like you haven't, that you earn rewards with good behavior, positive involvement with kids, just really investing time and connection with them, encouraging skills and problem solving, and monitoring and supervision. The more predictable the child's environment is, the less stress they feel, and the more they're able to be more attentive and regulate their emotions. So a big part of that is communicating to a child with age-appropriate language, having children practice their emotion regulation and attention, and manage family stress. So in the classroom too, that was parent training. In the classroom, kids are also learning to practice positive social interactions with their peers, build metacognitive awareness of different cognitive and emotional states. So being able to name your feelings, or being able to name the kind of thinking that you're doing, helps kids with emotion regulation. Practicing self-regulation strategies like deep breathing or self-redirection when you're stressed. So, oh, I'm really stressed out because I can't do this right now, but I can do this other thing. There's exercises in this program as well for naturally engaging sustained focused attention. You know, watching a snail crawl across the table for a long time is a concrete step that lets children feel what it is like to have sustained positive attention over time, and practice dealing with distractions as part of that as well. Just a couple more thoughts here. So some new directions that we're going with this line of work is online parent training for caregivers of children with intellectual or developmental disability or traumatic brain injury. You can find out more about that at totsproject.org. We're developing educational apps for children and adults with developmental disabilities or brain injury, and we're evaluating assessment tools to track change over time. Now, finally, I just want to, as we open things up for questions, I just wanted to give a couple prompts to you as well, maybe some things that you'd like to respond to that we could discuss. So here's a couple examples of some exercises that have an evidence base that could be adapted for children or for adult populations that are needing to, oops, sorry. Every time I move that window, there we go. So here's an example of an exercise called Small Kindnesses. Basically, you would reflect for a moment on something kind someone did for you recently. You think about what responses you had physically and emotionally when this person did this kindness. And then you brainstorm one act of kindness that you could perform in one day, like big or small, aiming for variety, kind of trying different things each day. And then thinking about why you chose these things. What values are you tapping into when you're doing these kind of things? And so, you know, why not give that a try yourself? But also think of an age group that you have a lot of experience working with, and how this might be adapted to be engaging and appropriate for their level. As we do these adaptions, or adaptations. Again, it's important to make things very concrete and age appropriate, but it's also, I just can't underestimate how important it is that we model these things ourselves. Children learn a lot through observation, and so the more that we tap into our own well-being, the more that we can improve the well-being of others. Another example, letting go of anger, relaxing for a moment, breathing in and out naturally, thinking of the person who offended you as a human being, wishing them well, and even though it can be hard, focusing on feelings of compassion. So this could also be adapted in a situation where a child is ramped up or feeling hurt or angry. But again, keeping it really concrete, keeping it focused on things that are at the kids' level can really help. So here's another few examples. A lot of these can be found, these types of exercises, at the Greater Good in Action website, ggia.berkeley.edu. There's some wonderful practices that you can engage with and adapt. So overall, I hope I gave you a sense of how our brain is plastic and supports complex social emotions. Hope I convinced you that they can be changeable even over a relatively short period of time. And I hope I gave you some ideas for how you might practice these things yourself or also adapt them to other ages and abilities. So with that, thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions. And also, if you'd like to email me anytime, my email address is there at the bottom, ckarns@uoregon.edu. Amanda?
Hi, Christina. Thank you so much. So everyone, it looks like we have just a few minutes left before the end of our session. This is a fabulous time to write in any questions that you have. There will be a chat box at the right of your screen. Feel free to chat in there and I will be able to read them to Christina. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that.
Sure. There we go.
And then I'm going to go ahead and pause recording for now.
Okay.